great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Andre Swart. Andre is from California. He studied in UC Davis, receiving a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. He worked at a winery after graduating and discovered how interesting winemaking is. I called him Flying Winemaker because he worked at wineries in France, New Zealand, New York, and California while returning to UC Davis for the Viticulture and Enology program, which is really awesome. And in this coming harvest, he will be working in Armida Winery in Hillsburg after graduation. Today, Andre is going to tell us all about interaction between wine and Saccharomyces cerevisiae leaves during aging. Let's give our warmly welcome to Andre.
Great, thanks for the nice introduction. So I'll be talking about the interactions between wine and Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast leaves during wine aging. I think that this is an important topic because it is still poorly understood and there's a significant cost associated with lees aging, which can exceed several years under some circumstances. So there's a lot of capital required, including the cost of storage vessels, labor, and the cost of not selling the wine and reinvesting the capital from the sale. So it's really important to understand what we can expect from lees aging in order to balance this with its costs. So here is an outline of what I'll be covering. I'll start with reviewing the standard industry practice. Then I'll talk about what important compounds are released into the wine during aging. And this will give us a good foundation to look at how these compounds interact with the wine, specifically with oxygen and phenolic compounds. And then I'll briefly introduce what we can expect from lees management in the future and highlight basically where we can go from here. So the TTB defines lees as the settlings of wine. We can expand on this definition and say that it is material that is settled, clarified, or filtered from the wine, specifically from post-fermentation to bottling. So basically what this means is that lees contain a high fraction of yeast material, and there's also likely bacteria from malolactic fermentation and inorganic material such as bitartrates and other non-soluble compounds. So, if you've ever had the opportunity to look into a barrel that has a clear head, you'd probably see something like this, where the lees form a compact layer at the bottom, and this is where some sort of mass transfer takes place between the surface of the lees and the wine above it. So the aging on lees process is highly variable, and it largely depends on location and style. So we'd expect to see a white wine from Burgundy would have a longer lees contact time than a Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough, for example. In the US, we can add Autolysis yeast and yeast cell walls in the winemaking process, but we can only use this as a primary fermentation aid. More recently, baker's yeast manna-protein has been allowed as a wine addition, but this is only for the purpose of bitartrate stabilization. So looking at this process flow chart, the impact of lees addition isn't really relevant in US winemaking currently. This will probably change eventually. There are other winemaking countries that currently allow lees additions to wine. So it's probably bound to happen sometime in the near future for the US. But for now, we're pretty much only focused on this arrow corresponding to the timing of lees removal. So when we talk about autolysis, we are referring to the enzymatic breakdown of non-viable cells. And this breakdown releases a bunch of compounds that we can categorize based on their structure. So we have nucleotides, saccharides, lipids, amino acids. Nucleotide concentration is typically extremely low. So we're really only interested in saccharides, amino acids, and lipids, which make up manna-proteins and sterols. And it's these two classes of compounds that are thought to be involved in many of the reactions that we see between lees and wine. So manoproteins are cell wall glycoproteins, meaning that they are proteins that contain a carbohydrate group. In Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the things that stand out is that they have a high mannose to glucose ratio and a very low percentage of protein. So they are pretty much mostly made up of polysaccharide. This image shows how manoproteins are arranged within the yeast cell wall. They typically make up about half of the cell wall and are covalently bonded to these beta glucans. So during autolysis, they become released by beta glucanases that basically separate this bond here. In wine, we see that their concentration increases with contact time. And I'm sure many of you who have worked in wineries have stirred wine barrels before. It's pretty common to do this with Chardonnay, for example. One of the ideas behind this is to increase the rate of manoprotein release. Right now, the research is somewhat mixed on how effective this is. So 1 month of weekly stirring might not result in much of a difference, but 6 months might. Basically, the biggest takeaway is that time has a huge effect, which is going to be true for most aging-related reactions in wine. All right. So now I'll be talking a little bit about lipids. For lipids, we see that sterile esters and triacylglycerols are present at the highest concentrations, while other lipids, such as sterols, mono and diacylglycerols, release at much lower concentrations. It's also a bit surprising that we don't see phospholipids in wine, since they are a major constituent of cell walls. And it is also still unclear how lipid concentration changes with time. The main complicating factor is that there are many enzymes being released during autolysis, and some are capable of degrading sterols and other lipids. So we basically have a situation where lipids are being released, but they are also being degraded. Right, so now I'll transition to talking about interactions with oxygen. This graph shows oxygen consumption rate and cell viability with time. One of the most important things that we see is that oxygen consumption continues even during 0 cell viability. So sometime, right around 500 hours here. And there are many variables that contribute to this rate. So first of all, oxygen concentration during fermentation has a huge impact. When you give the yeast more oxygen during fermentation, the yeast are then able to consume less oxygen during aging. We also see that cell concentration has an effect, so more cells leads to more oxygen being consumed. And then there are also differences between different wine types. So red wines are going to show lower oxygen consumption rates than white wines, which is probably due to some phenolic interactions, which I'll cover in a few slides. And then obviously temperature has an effect. So the consumption rate will decrease as temperature decreases. And then finally, we have the impacts of SO2. So at normal SO2 concentrations in wine, the lees lose pretty much all of their ability to consume oxygen. So unfortunately, it's not really possible to use both SO2 and lees in a complementary way to control oxygen during aging. But lees aging can be a useful tool to control oxygen if the winemaker chooses not to use SO2 in the aging process. So the mechanism of oxygen consumption is typically linked to the non-respiratory oxygen consumption pathway. Basically, the pathway relies on the uncoupling of the sterile and fatty acid synthesis pathway that I've shown here. Here, squalene is the sterile precursor, and ergosterol is essentially the fungi analog to cholesterol. So if we look at the inputs of this pathway, we see that oxygen plays a huge role. So if the pathway becomes uncoupled, it can produce reactive oxygen species like superoxide or hydrogen peroxide. And then these reactive oxygen species can then react with lipids present in the lees or in the wine. And we do see that ergosterol has been shown to be one of the primary targets of this. So we typically see that its concentration will go down over time. And it's not entirely clear still where the uncoupling comes from, but it could be from increased or reduced enzyme activity associated with the steps in this pathway. All right, so now I'll talk about interactions with phenolic compounds. This graph shows malvidin-3 glucoside and vitisin A concentrations with time. This is for a red wine aged with and without lees. What we see is that anthocyanin concentration decreases over time, but lees aging resulted in significantly higher malvidin concentration over time compared to the control. And we see that especially as time increases. And this same trend is true for other anthocyanins. The likely reason for this is that anthocyanins are adsorbed onto the lees cell walls, which is then preventing them from being oxidized or basically participating in other reactions. Vitisin A, on the other hand, as shown down here, didn't show a difference with lees aging, and neither did the other pyranoanthocyanins. But this result is expected since they're considered to be a form of stabilized pigment. So although we do see differences in color compounds, there really is no clear relationship between this and the wine's color intensity or hue. So I guess one of the main takeaways here is that the interactions are pretty complicated, especially because there appears to be strain-dependent release of molecules, especially manoproteins. So this table summarizes some of the key results from a couple of papers. One looking at red wine, the other looking at white wine, and then both using different yeast strains. The control wines were not aged on lees, and the treated wines were aged on lees for 4 months. So when we look at total polyphenols, the results are generally mixed. So sometimes lees aging resulted in higher concentrations, sometimes they resulted in lower concentrations. For tannin and flavin-3L monomers, aging on lees either causes no significant change or it decreases their concentration. So there's a bit more of a trend here. And as you can expect from all of this, the sensory results are also generally mixed, especially for white wine. For red wine, some papers indicate that lees aging causes no change in bitterness and astringency, while other papers indicate lowered bitterness and astringency, which aligns pretty well with the results that we see for tannin and flavin-3L monomers. The time that aging was carried out in these papers is probably one of the biggest factors here. The results in this table, as I've said, were obtained after 4 months of aging, so possibly a much shorter time than what many winemakers would do. But of course, it's really difficult to find research on lees aging that was done for more than 1 year. So I thought I'd end this by talking about accelerated lees aging techniques. The primary motivation behind these techniques is to reduce lees aging time and the costs associated with that by basically inducing autolysis rapidly. So the first technique that I'll highlight is ultrasound treatment, which basically causes cavitation. So this image shows untreated cells on the left and then ultrasound treated cells on the right. And the ultrasound treated cells, clearly have disrupted cell walls. So what we see in the wine is increased anthocyanin, but much lower pyranoanthocyanin and vitisin. So there's clearly some sort of disruption occurring between polyphenols and the lees biomass that we don't completely understand yet with ultrasound treatment. And the second method I'll highlight is pulsed electric fields, or PEF. This method works by basically increasing the cell wall permeability. So it's a bit similar to ultrasound treatment in the effects. This image shows a PEF generator, which would then be connected to some probes that the wine would pass through, and an electric field would be applied. Anyway, the results of PEF treatment are generally more favorable than that of ultrasound. Don't normally see a change in color, but there is usually significantly less tannin concentration than the untreated wines aged on lees. So anyway, these methods are, being actively researched because while the results aren't perfect yet, they still do hold quite a bit of promise. So the interactions between sterols, manoproteins, oxygen, and phenolic compounds are complex, and they strongly depend on contact time and yeast strain. In order to capture this complexity, more studies need to be done under realistic aging conditions, especially in regard to aging time and aging temperature. A lot of the current research is done under accelerated aging conditions, so usually at a significantly elevated temperature than what we'd normally do in practice. And finally, using non-Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast is becoming more common. So it's going to be even more important to characterize these interactions with different yeast species. We've already seen that there's a strong strain dependence, so we should also expect a large species-related difference as well. So I have a lot of people to thank for allowing me to come this far. First, I'd like to acknowledge my cohort. I've made many lifelong friends, and they've really acted as a valuable support group for the past couple of years. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Cantu and Professor Waterhouse for guidance during all of this. They were really there to answer any questions we may have had and steer us on the right track. I also want to acknowledge the VNE faculty for providing us with a valuable skill set that we'll definitely use a lot in our future careers. And finally, I've had generous support from scholarships and TA-ships through both the VNE and physics departments that have helped financially support my education here at UC Davis. So with that said, are there any questions for me?
I have a question, Andre.
Yep.
I don't know if you would have seen anything about this in the literature, but you mentioned how there were triacyl lipids present in wine, but there was no real evidence of phospholipids from yeast membranes.
Yep.
Did you see any suggestions or reasons why that might be?
Well, one of the biggest things is that, Autolysis releases a bunch of enzymes from the yeast. So it's generally thought that this is why we see, for example, certain protein fragments and we don't see other protein fragments. So I guess the idea is that, if we have a phospholipid that is being released, there might be some sort of enzyme that, transforms it into some other compound, or as, other compounds that wouldn't be then detected as a phospholipid. Or it is also thought that for whatever reason, phospholipids are just not being released into the autolysate or not being released into the wine. So they're still present there in the biomass, but they're just not being detected in the wine.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep.